Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. Pleasure to be here this morning. Thank you for listening. And we're going to continue in the book Rulers of Evil by F. Tupper Saucy. We just finished yesterday at the end of the broadcast, the tail end of the chapter 13 in the book. And we're now going to move to the next chapter, wherein we shall see how the Jesuits, which we now recognize as the unsung architects of the Enlightenment, supplied the American colonists a philosophical basis for rebelling against Great Britain. Chapter 14 of the book, page 129, is entitled The Dogma of Independence. What role did the Jesuits play in the fomentation of the Revolutionary War, and for what purpose, and who aided them in that endeavor? This is a very small chapter in the book, but it is full of information. And to make sure the meaning gets across, I'm not going to be able to just read the text without making copious comment. This is a book that takes a bit of time to digest and analyze. There's a lot of hidden information in this book that the author does not elaborate upon that needs elaboration. And so I'll do the best I can with this chapter, one of the smallest chapters, yet having the most information. So struggle along with me here, but we're going to learn something. It says the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, that is the method of learning, the method of teaching, the Ratio Studiorum, the Jesuit Ratio Studiorum, imbued Western culture with a purely Catholic political theory. This theory, as articulated by deist philosophers and politicians, ultimately became the rhetorical mainspring of American Revolution. It so impacted the world that its formulator and original apologist, a Jesuit priest by the name of Robert Bellarmine, was created a saint in 1930. So, figuring large in this chapter is this man, this Robert Bellarmine, a Jesuit priest, a member of the Order of the Society of Jesus, the Jesuit order, a warrior for the papacy, with the goal of destroying Protestantism and uniting the world under the papacy's authority in a new world order. He was created a saint in 1930. So in order to achieve sainthood in the Roman Catholic Church, you have to be a miracle worker. And this Robert Bellarmine, as we see in the book, did indeed do great works for the Roman Catholic Church for its benefit. That's why he was made a saint in 1930. Not for the good works he did, but for the works that he did that benefited the Roman Catholic cult. Now, he says, prior to Henry VIII's break with the Roman papacy in the middle 1530s and subsequent creation of the Church of England, kings regarded themselves within their respective realms as the anointed vicars of God for secular purposes only. After Henry's schism, Protestant kings assumed God's anointment covered religious purposes as well. Now, remember, King Henry VIII was Catholic. And over a disagreement with the papacy, he broke with Roman Catholicism and joined the Protestants, claimed himself to be a Protestant. And he created the Church of England, separated the church. The nation had its own church, the Church of England, supposedly Protestant church, but nonetheless, as we'll learn in the book, the Church of England held to many of the same teachings of the Roman Catholic Church. It just rejected the papacy and the papacy's authority. And at that time, before the break, the Protestant ministers, or the Protestant kings, regarded themselves as kings by divine right. In other words, they held the attributes of the papacy in that regard, in that they claimed their right to rule by divine authority, as authority as having come from God, and that they were, in a sense, vicars of God, replacements of God on the earth. But they held that view only for the purposes of governing the people, and not as spiritual heads as well, unlike the papacy, which claims both powers, the power to rule the world and the power to govern over spiritual things as well. But after the schism with the Roman Catholic Church, the Church of England and the rest of the Protestant kings of Europe added to their divine right the spiritual right as well, and they became vicars of their own church. And the author says here, he says they became infallible popes of their own national churches. In other words, they all became little popes with two keys: authority over the natural world and authority over the spiritual world. Now, what do you think the papacy thought of this? The papacy heretofore always enjoyed supremacy. The right, the divine right, as the apostolic successor of Peter, the replacement of the Son of God on earth, and the replacement of the Caesars of Rome, both spiritual authority and governmental authority. And they seated the kings, and they in many cases even crowned them. But at the time of the schism, Rome was cast aside, and these rebel Protestant kings became their own little popes. So that diminished, even at the time of the Protestant Reformation, when the Roman Catholic Church was on the ropes to begin with, that diminished even further the relative insignificance of the papacy. A papacy that absolutely desires to rule the world. So don't think for a minute that Rome's not going to retaliate in some way. Not only just simply over a matter of disagreement between Henry VIII, but over the entire Protestant idea, and particularly this arrogant rebellion against the papacy and the Protestant kings beginning to act like little popes themselves. He says these Protestant kings became infallible popes of their own national churches, following the biblical teaching that the ruler is God's minister to thee for good. Protestant kings claimed to rule by divine right, holding absolute sway over their subjects. In the maxim of divine right's greatest champion and James I's private theologian, Sir Robert Fillmore, the king can do no wrong. So this Sir Robert Fillmore, an Englishman, holds to the divine right of kings. And this is what I didn't understand early in my research, that the Protestants, many of them, were having trouble letting go of their Roman Catholic roots and adopting Christ as the head of the church and an equality for mankind under Christ's headship. And they began to see themselves as little popes. And Sir Robert Filmer defended this divine right of kings. Now that would support the papacy, would it not? Yes, it would. The papacy's authority in the world is entirely based on the theory of the divine right of kings. Yet this Robert Filmer is defending the divine right of kings to protect the Protestant kings. Interesting, and it's important for us to understand this. And it says, divine right's staunchest opponent was Robert Bellarmine, private theologian to the Pope, Clement VIII, who reigned from 1592 to 1605, who made him Cardinal Bellarmine of 1599. Now let's analyze this statement a little bit. Divine rights, the idea of divine right, the most staunch opponent of the divine right to rule, the divine right of kings, he says, is Robert Bellarmine. Now, Robert Bellarmine is a Jesuit priest. He's a militia for the Pope. He's a militia for the Black Pope. He sees not only the white Pope, but his Black Pope as the vicar of Christ, the replacement of the Son of God on earth. As a Jesuit, he must believe in the divine right. But he puts himself out as an opponent of divine right. Now, that's entirely antagonistic to the entire structure of the Roman Catholic Church and its history. It attacks the very seat of its power, and that is the apostolic succession, the self-proclaimed apostolic succession. And here we have a Jesuit priest by the name of Robert Bellarmine, who was made a saint in 1930, becomes one of the most staunch opponents of the divine right theory. But he's a private theologian to the Pope, Clement VIII. Now, do we suppose that the Pope is teaching Bellarmine, or is Bellarmine a consultant to the Pope? Bellarmine is a theologian to the Pope, it says. So there's a very close relationship between Robert Bellarmine, this Jesuit priest, and the Pope. Well, what do you suppose they're talking about? The Jesuits are suffering, or actually committing suicide. We're talking about this Sun Tzuan ruse, the apparent destruction of Jesuitism and the decline of the Roman Catholic Church as a result of the Protestant Reformation. What do you think this theologian Robert Bellarmine and the Pope are talking about? They're talking about survival. They're talking about the survival of the Roman Catholic Church. And it says that Pope Clement VIII made Bellarmine a cardinal in 1599. Now, you don't become a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church for just being a nice guy and being popular among your bishops. You become a cardinal in the Roman Catholic Church for having served the papacy and have done great service to the papacy. Now, we have to assume that as he was made a cardinal by Clement VIII, he did something as a theologian to the Pope that benefited the papacy. And we're going to see what that was as we continue. He says, Cardinal Bellarmine Cardinal Bellarmine, the Jesuit priest who became a cardinal, appealed to the self-interest of the common man, something the divine rights system failed to do. Now, this is interesting. The Jesuit order is a hierarchical. As we've learned throughout this book, the Jesuit order is a hierarchical system. A Jesuit is not allowed to think, believe, or do anything except by instruction of the Jesuit general. It is the most subservient order of all the Roman Catholic holy orders. They're like robots. They're like inanimate sticks in the hands of an old man. They don't equivocate. They don't hesitate. They don't ruminate about anything. When the Jesuit speaks, they act. They do exactly what they're told when they're told to do it. And they don't do anything more than they're told to do. And here is this Jesuit, Cardinal Bellarmine, appealing to the self-interest of the common man. When in Roman Catholic history has the Roman Catholic Church ever appealed to the self-interest of the common man? The entire history of Roman Catholicism demonstrates that the papacy's teaching is that man is born to be ruled. And throughout all Roman Catholic history, there were two classes of people. The rich ruling elite, the priests and their assigns, their kings, and the serfs who served. The people were kept illiterate and under servitude, and they lived to serve the church. When in all of Roman history did the Roman Catholic Church ever appeal to the self-interest of the common man? And here's the admission in the second clause of this sentence. It says something the divine right system failed to do. That's absolutely true. The divine right system never appealed to the self-interest of the common man. The common man was not allowed to even express his own interests. They were controlled in thought, word, and deed. And anybody who got an idea to think for himself and contradict the church and its teaching was labeled a heretic and burned at the stake. Okay, many people don't know this. All right, this Cardinal Bellarmine invented what we know now today as liberation theology, according to F. Tupper Saucy. That Cardinal Bellarmine, this Jesuit priest, created or invented liberation theology. Now, I'm going to have to leave it up to my listeners to investigate liberation theology on their own. It's a big subject. There are many permutations of this thing called liberation theology, but we will talk about it in the context that F. Tupper Saucy uses in his book, and that is to describe this idea that man is somehow liberated from this divine right and has liberty. Spiritual and temporal liberty should not be controlled by the divine writers. That is, the Protestant divine writers. Here's what's happened. The Protestant Reformation has brought into serious question the papacy's right to rule, to seat the kings, and to rule supreme in the world. The Protestants break away and then set up a similar system. The Protestant kings defining themselves as divine writers when they have rejected the Pope's divine right to rule. So what is the Jesuit going to do? He's going to foment to make sure that this divine right system under Protestantism fails. So this Jesuit priest is going to liberate the people so that they rebel against their Protestant kings. They're fomenting discord, fomenting the order set forth by the Protestant Reformation, or those Protestant kings who want to simply set up their own divine right. So we have a cardinal, a Jesuit priest, close advisor to the Pope, is coming up with this new theology that is entirely antithesis to the entire history of the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. He actually condemns the divine right. But of course, as it applies to the Protestant divine writers. And so he's fomenting a rebellion, a revolution. And he says, speaking of Cardinal Bellarmine and his liberation theology, he says, drawing on Aristotle and St. Thomas Aquinas, Robert Bellarmine maintained that God anointed no kings. That God anointed no kings, but instead gave sovereignty directly and naturally to the people. Now, when in history has the Roman Catholic Church ever said such a thing? First of all, that a man has sovereignty? Not at all. Sovereignty belongs to those who make the laws, the Pope and the magisterium. Sovereignty is complete independence. Nobody can bring to trial a sovereign. No one can base a charge against a sovereign. He's the lawgiver, and he's immune from the law. Diplomatic immunity. But now this Jesuit priest is suggesting that God anoints no kings, but instead gave sovereignty directly and naturally to the people. Now, all of a sudden, after so many centuries of servitude to the papacy, we have a Jesuit priest calling the paupers sovereigns. Teaching a teaching that absolutely destroyed the papacy's authority in the world by the Protestant reformers. And he's teaching this to lead a rebellion against these Protestant kings. It says the people were free to confer their sovereignty upon whomever or whatever they chose. Robert Bellarmine is saying that the people were now free to confer their sovereignty, which they never had under the Roman Catholic system. No man had sovereignty. The Pope only had sovereignty. Now the people have their sovereignty, and they may confer it upon whomsoever they chose. The right of the people to govern is what we're talking about. In other words, the people have their sovereignty, but they can bestow it upon someone else and then become servants to someone else. That was never possible under the Roman Catholic system. And it said, should the people's chosen sovereign prove himself or itself unworthy to govern for any particular reason, the people had the right to depose him and start anew with any form of government they deem necessary. Any form of government they deem necessary, whether monarchy, aristocracy, or republic. So not only can they confer their sovereignty to someone else, but if that sovereign who represents them becomes unworthy, they may depose that entire government or that sovereignty, bring it back to themselves, and create another government to represent them. This all coming from a Jesuit priest. We'll be back right after the messages. You're listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
Welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to support Inquisition Update and keep this broadcast on the air, please support First Amendment Radio, who pays the bills. And make a contribution, subscribe, and remember that the program is heard 10 a.m. Central, 11 Eastern, and again, rebroadcast at 6 p.m. Central, 7 p.m. Eastern. And if those opportunities aren't available to you, please, with your subscription, you may have access to the archives and listen at your leisure. Now, we're turning to this teaching, this incredible teaching of a Jesuit priest by the name of Cardinal Robert Bellarmine, suggesting that the people had sovereignty and that they may choose their own form of government, and that they may depose their own kings. Totally contrary to the entire history of the teaching of the Roman Catholic Church. But the design of this teaching now is to upset the Protestant divine writers, particularly the Church of England. And it says, understandably, the Protestant monarchs bitterly hated and despised Cardinal Bellarmine. Why? Because they were fomenting a revolution against their self-proclaimed divine right to rule. He says, a collegio anti-Bellarminianum, a college against Cardinal Bellarmine, was established at Heidelberg to train Lutherans on how to cope with Bellarmine's democratic egalitarianism. So the Protestants or the Lutherans had to learn how to deal with Bellarmine's undermining teaching. It says Queen Elizabeth, who was Protestant, Great Britain, Queen Elizabeth, ordered that Bellarmine be lectured against at Cambridge. The lecturer, while reading the material of the Cardinal to refute him, converted to Roman Catholicism. He must have liked Cardinal Bellarmine's teaching, and he thought the answer would be to convert to Roman Catholicism. I had to laugh when I first read this. He jumped out of the frying pan and into the fire. But nonetheless, it continues. It says Theodore Beza, who succeeded John Calvin as the head of the Protestant Church at Geneva, is said to have declared of Bellarmine's magnum opus, or his magnificent work, or his greatest work, Christian Controversy, quote, "This book has ruined us." So Bellarmine is putting the divine right Protestant kings and patriarchs on the ropes, fomenting revolution, even to the degree that they say that this book has ruined us. And it says, of the process of making the enemy move as one wishes, Sun Tzu wrote, quote, "The great science," that is, what science is he talking about? The art of war. How to win over your enemies without even having to raise a sword. That art of war, that Sun Tzuan art of war. He says that great science is to make him, that is your enemy, desire everything you wish him to do, and to provide him with all the means to help you in this without his even realizing it. Unquote. Thus, liberation theology reached the American revolutionaries through the voice and energies of its principal adversary, Sir Robert Filmer. Now, Robert Filmer was a divine writer, and he took up a counterposition to that of Cardinal Bellarmine, a liberation theologist. And as astutely as any Sun Tzuan warrior, they used this proponent of a divine writer to support Cardinal Bellarmine's liberation theology. And you're thinking to yourself, how in the world did he do that? It says Sir Robert Filmer spent the first 4 pages of Patriarcha, that's a book that he wrote in 1680, talking about the patriarchal power of the divine right, his illustrious defense of divine right monarchy, refuting Cardinal Bellarmine. But his refutations contain so much material from Cardinal Bellarmine's works that Patriarcha amounts to nothing less than a concise introduction to Bellarminian theory. So in his attempt to destroy the Bellarminian theory of liberation theology, he used so much of his work that it became counterproductive. It actually sold the Bellarminian teaching of liberation theology. It says the 2 most conspicuous reviewers of Patriarcha were Alger Algernon Sidney, Puritan's greatest political philosopher, and John Locke, the voice of enlightenment in England and America. Now, let me talk a little bit about this. We're talking about two particular reviewers of this Robert Fuller work about the divine right of kings, in support of the divine right of kings, which is a direct way to defend the Protestant divine writers, particularly the Church of England. All right? One of them's name was Algernon Sidney, and he was a Puritan. Apparently, according to this work, it says Puritan's greatest political philosopher. Now, let me say something about the Puritans. Without knowing a great deal about Puritanism, I know that they despised the entire idea of divine right of kings, that Christ was the head of the church and we are all brethren, and that the divine right institution of the papacy was blasphemy, and likewise the divine right institution of the Protestant kings were likewise blasphemous, usurping the rightful throne of Christ. And so Sidney, Algernon Sidney, being a Puritan and one of their greatest political philosophers, and then also John Locke, the voice of enlightenment in England and America. Now, what was the Enlightenment? Let's review a little bit what the Enlightenment age was. That was a result of this ratio studiorum, this method of learning whereby men's attentions were focused away from the Bible. Now that they'd learned to read and they'd gotten their own copy of the Bible and they were learning about Christ as the head of the church, and they were learning about God's law, and that they didn't need a priest, they didn't need a pope, and they didn't even need a church. And it was fomenting a rebellion against the Roman Catholic Church, so they had to flood the world with so much information as to attract people's attentions away from the Bible. The ratio studiorum, and learning against learning. And so they focused people's attention on the sciences and the arts and academia and philosophy and all sorts of intellectual distractions. Much like what we would regard television today. Entertainment. Just something to take your mind and your time away from the Bible. Now remember, the Protestant reformer Martin Luther said, if you take the Bible out of the schools, they'll become pits of hell. Yeah, even Martin Luther knew that if you take the Bible away from man, you've taken the truth away from him, and he's subject to any wind of false doctrine, any wind of false information, any wind of distraction, and he's literally a pagan. And he could go any number of ways. And one of those was the Enlightenment. Learning about nature and the sciences and the arts and philosophy. That was the great Enlightenment. And that told men that we no longer need the Scriptures. We no longer need scriptural dogma and salvation. We believe that God created the world and established the laws that governed it, and then took his hand away from it, and it's up to us now to learn how to get along. We have to create our own forms of government, we have to have our own philosophies, and we have to transcend. In other words, to save ourselves. That was the Enlightenment, and that threatened the papacy as well. Because the papacy wanted the world to see it as the great Savior, the great authority, the great sovereign, the great rule maker, and the great provider. Okay, so we have Algernon Sidney has taken a look at this Patriarcha, and also John Locke, the voice of enlightenment in England and America. And it says Algernon Sidney's name means little to modern Americans, but in his day and for generations after, it was synonymous with individual liberty. synonymous with individual liberty. It says babies and country estates were called Sidney in his honor, even though he was beheaded in 1683 for plotting the death of King Charles II. Sidney's philosophical admirers loved his open hostility to Roman Catholicism. They ignored his intrigues with the Jesuits of Louis XIV and his long visits to Rome. Now, the author doesn't explain this, and I think it's an oversight on this author's point not to explain about this. And it's something that I'm curious about and may have to investigate a little bit on my own. But it puts even Sidney at question. Even though he was openly hostile to Roman Catholicism, why was he involved with the Jesuits of Louis XIV, and why did he pay long visits to Rome? Anyway, it says, Discourses Concerning Government, his most celebrated work, was known respectfully as the Noble Book. After its republication in 1763, along with an account of his preposterous trial, and the author says that it was preposterous because there was no indictment, no assistance of counsel, there was perjured testimony, tainted evidence, and a packed jury. It says, it included an account of his preposterous trial. It could be found in the library of every affluent home in America, this book, Discourses Concerning Government. All right? That's Sidney's book. Sidney began Discourses with the following sentence, quote, having lately seen a book entitled Patriarcha, written by Sir Robert Filmer concerning the universal and undistinguished right of all kings, I thought a time of leisure might well be employed to examining this doctrine and the question arising from it, which seemed to concern all mankind, unquote. Whereupon, quoting Filmer quotations of Bellarmine, Sidney goes on to attack Filmer and in the process defends Bellarmine. So here we have another, a Puritan who winds up actually defending Bellarmine, a Roman Catholic priest, in his liberation theology. Now, naturally, a Puritan took issue with the divine right of kings, whether it be Roman Catholic, the papacy, or whether it be the Protestant divine righters. But in his attempt to critique Filmer's dissertation on the divine right of kings in the book Patriarcha, he's seen as defending this Jesuit priest. So now we have even more weight being added to foment a rebellion against the Protestant monarchies by a Puritan source. Things are beginning to add up. The pressure against the Protestant monarchy is really rising now. And the author continues, he says, how wondrously Sun Tzu, that a trusted Protestant thinker would indoctrinate a nation of fellow Catholic bashers with the teachings of a Jesuit cardinal. How wondrously Sun Tzuan, that a trusted Protestant thinker would indoctrinate a whole nation of fellow Catholic bashers with the teachings of a Jesuit cardinal. And for what purpose? To start a revolution against the Protestant monarchies. It says, John Locke held such influence over revolutionary intellectuals that historians often label him America's philosopher. He, too, endorsed Bellarmine by attacking Filmer. On the title page of his two treatises on government, 1690, Locke advertises that he will refute Patriarcha with reasoning wherein, quote, the false principles and foundation of Sir Robert Filmer and his followers are detected and overthrown, unquote. He then expounds Cardinal Bellarmine in his own words that will become the rationale of the American Revolution. Quote, Men being by nature all free, equal, and independent, no one can be put out of his estate and subjected to the political power of another without his consent, unquote. Those are the words of the Revolution, the American Revolution against Great Britain. It says, the personal library, the main author of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson, contained a copy of Patriarcha and also a handsome folio of 487 pages of discourses of Algernon Sidney. Quote, if Jefferson read but the opening pages of Sidney's and Filmer's works, Bellarmine scholar John Robert Rager wrote in 1926, quote, he had the principles of democracy as propounded by Bellarmine in a nutshell. It is more than likely, however, that the curiosity of Jefferson prompted him to look more deeply into the original writings of his Catholic schoolmen. He had not far to go. In the library of Princeton University was a copy of Cardinal Bellarmine's works. James Madison, a member of the committee which framed the Virginia Declaration of Rights, was a graduate of Princeton, probably read Bellarmine, for at this period of his life he read everything he could lay his hands on and was deeply versed in religious controversy. It might be remarked that several members of the committee which drew up the Virginia Declaration of Rights had been educated in England, where the writings of Bellarmine were not unpopular even among those who were most inimical to his faith, unquote. The operative philosophy of the Declaration of Independence is easily traceable to Bellarminian liberation theology. Now we're showing Bellarminian liberation theology being the basis, the philosophy behind the Declaration of Independence. According to Bellarminian liberation theology, Cardinal Bellarmine says, quote, political power emanates from God. Government was introduced by divine law, but the divine law has given its power to no particular man, unquote. Now stop and think about this for a minute. He says the divine law introduces, authorizes government. But it says the divine law has no power to assign to a particular man. Doesn't that undermine the papacy? Certainly it does. Directly undermines the papacy. But the papacy's not the target. Remember, the papacy appears to be non-effectual in the world anymore. We've got a cardinal now attacking the divine writers called Protestants. And now he's teaching directly against Roman Catholic canon law. But nonetheless, it's being picked up by the revolutionaries in this country. Now, this theory that political power emanates from God and God was introduced and government was introduced by divine law, but the divine law has given this power to no particular man, is mirrored in the Declaration of Independence by this phrase: the people are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. Certain inalienable rights. Another Bellarminian teaching is, quote, society must have power to protect and preserve itself, unquote. And that is reflected in the Declaration of Independence in the phrase, to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. Bellarmine also taught, quote, the people themselves immediately and directly hold the political power. He's talking about sovereignty again. We talked about that earlier. That's how he reflected it. His statement is, again, the people themselves immediately and directly hold the political power. That is translated in the Declaration of Independence as, quote, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, unquote. Another Bellarminian principle is, quote, all men are born naturally free and equal, unquote. That is reflected in our Constitution as all men are created equal. And lastly, it's another Bellarminian theory is, quote, for legitimate reason, the people can change the government to an aristocracy or a democracy or vice versa, unquote. And that is reflected in our Declaration of Independence as, quote, whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and to institute a new government, unquote. So our Declaration contains the basis of the theories established by Cardinal Bellarmine, a Jesuit priest. And the author adds, interestingly, Patriarcha of 1680 was not published until 28 years after its author, Sir Robert Filmer's death. It arrived in an era of dwindling hopes for divine right, the concept having been thoroughly discredited when King Charles I was beheaded in 1625. Could it be that Patriarcha was edited or ghostwritten by Jesuits at the command of Superior General John Paul Oliva? The purpose would have been to induce the enemies of Roman Catholicism to follow Bellarmine by having Bellarminian liberation attacked by a loser, Filmer, the disgraced champion of a lost Protestant cause. Divine right of kings, a lost Protestant cause. It says the idea is not far-fetched when one considers actual outcome. For Patriarcha did in fact produce the theory of revolution that impelled the colonists to create a nation subservient to the black papacy. This author is showing us how the Jesuit order fomented a revolution against the Protestant divine writers of Great Britain and even formed the basis for our own Declaration of Independence. And for what purpose? So that the black papacy could use this country. Now, it's a concept that is not going to be pleasant to contemplate for a lot of people. And I'm not sure I buy it all. But it certainly explains what I'm seeing in this country today with the Vatican taking so much control in our country. Now, while I've run out of time, we'll return to this tomorrow on the broadcast. You're listening to Inquisition Update on FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Stay tuned for more godly teaching on First Amendment Radio. I'll see you tomorrow.
The book of Revelation says, the spirit of prophecy is the testimony of Jesus Christ. This is at the very heart of FirstAmendmentRadio.com. In that spirit, we have created the Prophecy Reality News app for all of your mobile devices, streaming First Amendment Radio 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Available for your Apple, Android device, and smartphone, absolutely free. Get the Prophecy Reality News app installed today so you can listen to First Amendment Radio wherever you are. The Prophecy Reality News app. Get it now.
Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity. Invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.